"I have no more silver," she said, then added, "No silver." The blacksmith frowned, as being him steam from the dousing sink mingled with the roar of the pouring rain outside. "A Briton?" he asked, frowning. Osrith paused, wondering about the answer. She could never say she was of Northumbria, and her accent betrayed she was no Saxon. Were Britons well received in Wessex? Gaelish, Osrith replied, the safest thing she could think of, too far away to really be a threat. If the blacksmith had ever heard of Gaelish people at all. But he must have heard something, for he broke into a smile. "My mother," the blacksmith confided, "was of Wales." "The Gaels are of the same people, are they not?" He smiled encouragingly at Osrith, and she nodded. The blacksmith then looked back to Buea, taking her up again. When she tried to protest, for she had no more silver, he placed 2 bronze coins into her hand. "Done," he said. A few minutes later, in the same way Osrith had proffered her sword, the blacksmith offered it to her, blade first, so she could receive the handle. Buea looked incredible. Her blade was straighter than when she had acquired her, in Tara, at the fighting contest. Her shaft was no longer dull but shined like the moon. And, when she swung her before the blacksmith, she moved cleaner, and quicker. "I see you at the alehouse," the blacksmith told her. Osrith strained to understand. "At the inn, you." The man reshaped his sentence. Osrith nodded. "And you fight?" "I wish to be at the palace." "Palace guard?" she asked. But the blacksmith shook his head. "They have all the men they need." "But, King Alfred's army always needs a few men." He glanced at Osrith's scabbard as Osrith thought, "Army?" That was always a possibility. "And, I hope it pays well." "Here," the blacksmith said, offering Osrith a piece of fleece. "To keep the blade oiled," he added. Osrith nodded. She had lost the last piece she had back at the palace, at Dunnottar, which Osrith still caught herself thinking of as home, and Buea, not only not being the best kept sword when she first acquired her, had only got worse. "My thanks," Osrith said, looking out at the now only spitting rain. It turned out that the palace was indeed looking for warriors for their army, for she had spoken to one of the sentries on guard at the hugely impressive stone building which was the capital city of the last independent kingdom of England. But the captain of the King's Guard would not be seeing anyone until the next day. The Palace of Wessex. It was more impressive than she could have thought. Dunnottar was not much than half its size, and was more enclosed, guarding itself with its own walls, whereas King Alfred's palace was contained within its own citadel, like Caerllegwade, with a boundary wall, guarded in all 4 directions by household guards. They had both been Roman cities, Osrith knew, so perhaps that was why they were similar, and similar to the Roman wall that divided England from Alba, which Domhnall had expressed was his grandfather's desire to use as his own boundary, taking all of the land up to it as a part of his lands. And that suited Osrith, for displacing her uncle would be exactly what he deserved. And then, the reason she was in Wessex crystallized in Osrith's mind. She was here to find her brother, who was similarly treated by Elfric. Was that the only reason she was here? But then, as she approached the 2 cranes, she thought, he is family. She was Utard's sister, he was her brother. That had to count for something. With a refurbished sword but only 2 pennies, Osrith picked her way through the inn. She could now buy food, and she stood near the bar waiting to be served, but would not a room. Perhaps the she-wolf would not mind company until she could report to the palace in the morning to seek employment. For a damp afternoon, the inn was bereft of its usual number of customers. As she stood waiting in the moist straw covering earth, a boy of about 8 came in through the back door of the inn, grinning at her. "Food?" he asked. "I'll get Mama." He had gone before Osrith could protest, because Mama was a young woman who worked at the inn in many capacities, and had encouraged Osrith to use her silver to pay for a room. And the rain had begun again, so when the boy's mother Elfber appeared with meat and bread, she twinkled at Osrith. "Won't be too much trouble to make up a bed," she encouraged. But Osrith shook her head. "I have enough money only for food," she said, definitely, remembering the young woman's insistence she spend some of her silver with her, horizontally. Like half, Elfber assumed she was a man. Osrith glanced at the rain, its rate accelerating, and she did wish she could rather than fight the she-wolf for shelter. The girl left her alone with one backwards glance, Osrith noticed, and gripped Bue's handle, before eyeing the meal. She couldn't blame her. Whatever had led Elfber to prostitution could so easily have been her fate, with Sven Kjartansson, if her uncle Elfric had has his wish. She had just been chattel, but Osrith knew she could fight, and that had saved her from the Danes, at least. And, were she to find her brother, she would not give her life over to him, for him to decide. She must make decisions carefully. She must, if and when she found him. More men trickled into the inn as Osrith but into the meat and bread, Elfber keeping an eye on her. She noticed. Even if she was a man and did want to hump her, Osrith couldn't have paid her in any case, and when the girl brought some mail through to her, Osrith beckoned to her. "I cannot pay for this, I cannot pay for a bed," she said. The girl nodded, lowering her head to Osrith. "Have it anyway, you have been overcharged by my stepfather too many nights, and a bed for the night." But Osrith shook her head. It was too easy to fall into debt and have people chase her. She had seen a man being beaten until he couldn't stand a week ago in one of the back streets near Winchester's main commercial thoroughfare. She would find a sheltered spot for the night and try the next morning to gain a position at the palace. "Come back later?" Elfber asked, dipping her head close to Osrith's ear. She didn't turn. It was clear Elfber was trying to garner custom. "Later I will still have no money," Osrith pointed out. But she didn't move her head, and when Osrith turned, the girl's lips met her cheek. "No," Osrith said firmly, pulling away and placing the copper coins into her hand. "My thanks for the good food, and your honesty." An hour later, opening the door onto a damp street smelling of animals, Osrith headed towards the woods again, beyond the city's walls, but found that the west gate, and the south had been barred. "No one in or out tonight," a guard called down to her. "King's orders." Did that mean the king thought the city was going to be attacked? She really did not have anywhere to go now, Osrith thought. She had turned down a possible genuine offer of a bed, and could not sleep outdoors in shelter beyond the city. Guards were on duty by day and night, so most people were moved on, or arrested, and while she did want to get into the palace, being on the wrong side was not what she meant. It was getting dark now, the spring day bringing a chilly night to it. Osrith did not know Winchester well. Was there a bridge where archers could offer shelter? She knew where the Britons lived, in the north, at Crapelgate, but they always wanted paying for anything, and generously. East. She hadn't tried east, towards the downlands. Maybe something was there and her luck would turn. The stars were well risen by the time Osrith reached the east gate. Again, as with the west and south gates, it too was barred, and nothing but houses and hovels, guarded by blade or dog. Osrith turned. Maybe she had been too proud to have turned down the offer of the bed at the Two Cranes. Maybe Elfber's offer was genuine. If she returned, maybe she could sleep there after all. An unmistakable sound of a sword swooshing from the lined scabbard made Osrith turn. In the darkness there was little to see, but a crunch to her left drew her right. She held Bue close to her face, waiting. Then there was nothing. Osrith felt her heart thumping behind her bindings. And still she waited, just in case. So, as the moon began to rise, Osrith trod carefully along the road that took her back to the tradespeople in the center of Winchester. The moon, at least, was casting a shadow along the dirt path. Many candles were lit now and she could navigate back to the kneeling cross. And then it came, an attack from behind her. As Osrith had turned to walk up the hill towards the Two Cranes, the lunge came. It was the man's step she heard first. The heavy thump to the left that suggested there was going to be a jab to the right. Hand on Bue, Osrith thrust out, the blade feeling foreign in her hand as its renewal by the blacksmith's hand had shifted its center of balance. She stumbled, and would have been beaten had not the assailant been aiming his blow towards another figure, now crumpled in a heap by his feet. Osrith gripped Bue again, forcing the attacker away from the stricken form who, by the look of it, was a man, waving his arms about, trying to fend off the blow. She struck, stabbing the assailant in the arm. He dropped his own blade and ran. Before offering the victim her arm, Osrith looked around her. Were there more attackers? And why this man? It took mere minutes to discover, as she helped the man to his feet, that he was Lord Odda, of Devonshire, who rewarded Osrith with a position in his guard. "You'll grow," the Lord said the next day, when Miral, the head of his household guard, had been summoned to his large house within reach of the palace and had looked scornfully up and down Osrith's frame. "And, I am most grateful for saving this old man's life." He laughed at that. His guards laughing too, for he has not yet given up fighting beside Alfred. Miral the Mercen guard muttered after Lord Odda had left. "Take pity, he has no son now." Elfrith, Odda's best swordsman, lamented. "And now we are off to Exansuista," a third guard complained. "Just when I have been enjoying the palace maids." So, that was how Osrith entered the service of Odda and found herself, a week later, at his country estate guarding a woman, his goddaughter, by the name of Mildrith, and that he had no son because of Odda the Younger's treachery to Alfred. 88,888,888. "He was drunk, I tell you," Miral muttered to Elfrith one morning as the guards mucked out the stable. Osrith looked up, and was greeted with a sneer from the head guard. "And, what are you staring at, bastard Briton?" he shouted at Osrith, then threw the handle of a reaping hook in her direction. Osrith turned and it bounced, hard, off her back. Osrith's understanding of Saxon was improving, and she could have ignored Achim, but instead, she replied, "I am a Gael, not a Briton." Miral sneered at her. "You're a weedy piece of shit, you are," he shot back, pulling out his own sword. "Can barely understand your gruntings." He narrowed his eyes. "Where is Gael land anyway?" "North," Osrith replied. "Irian, Dulria du Alba, where even the lowliest warrior is a million times better than you are, you piece of hog turd." "All Abba." Miral rolled the word on his lips. "Full of Norse, I heard." He bore down on Osrith as she felt for Bué. "Sure you're not Norse with that pale hair of yours?" "I fought Norse," Osrith shot back. "I killed Norse." She felt her hand go instinctively to her blade. But, it would not do to unsheath Bué. Yet, Miral was not in the mood to listen. He bore down on her. A glimpse above indicated there was someone watching them from the upper story, and he flicked his eyes upwards, sheathed his sword reluctantly. "Go to that snivelling Daiger then," he growled. "You fell on your feet with Lord Odda there." And, so it turned out, Osrith had been lucky. It was barely a job accompanying Mildrith around the estate. Tall, brown-haired Mildrith, who never smiled, whose eyes might have once been merry with life, but were full and downcast, who took things slowly, and cared for Odda as if he were her father. It also turned out that Osrith had displaced Miral from the easy job, for it was he who had meant to have been guarding Odda in Winchester and had become separated from his lord. Elfrith told her, confidentially, that Odda suspected Miral of sneaking off for a drink himself, which is why he had been given night watch duties, not befitting the head of the guard. He was of Mercia, Elfrith, a native of Devonshire and born gossip, told Osrith one day, and resented being traded by Lord Shoyulf with a guard in Odda's service. His one desire in the world was to return to Mercia. But Odda did see mould, and perhaps, Osrith suspected, his age and his deep head injury a death hand done, was confusing him. Plus, with no son now, there had few life events to hook him to the present. Some days, he did not rise, and others, Elfrith had told her, he thought his wife and son were somewhere in the estate and frantically sent men to find them. No wonder Mildrith cared for him in an almost startled way, fretting over his meals, his rest. 4 months, and Osrith lived quietly, and lived well, healing and growing stronger in the country estate of Lord Odda with only the quarrelsome Miral to challenge her. She could dress privately, and she still had a good quantity of lily root which, Osrith had discovered, when steeped in milk, reduced her monthly bleeding to almost nothing. Not that she was in any mood to be in the situation that is stopped pregnancy. Her mind was fixed on work and passing human relationships. Her unhappiness at her immediate past in Alba buried deep within her. It was just past the lean month and harvest was almost upon them. Around them, the poor worked the land, and they were to help. No grain meant both poor and rich starved at equal measure. It had been no problem for her to keep up her disguise, and she made sure she fought left-handed to not appear as good as the 20 or so guards who trained with one another. The land of Devonshire was bounteous. It was no wonder the Danes wanted it so badly, and why the people of Wessex defended it with such might. And Osrith could hear the sigh there, in the tall mountains and valleys, who she could not hear in Winchester, talking amongst themselves as they did in Alba and Dalriada and Irian. There were few incursions, despite being harvest, the hit-and-run tactics of the Danes not extending, yet, to Exansuster, although, Elfrith told Osrith, that had not always been the case. A Dane called Scorpa and another called Juba had been the scourge of that part of Wessex. Until they were defeated, by Alfred's men, Elfrith said, happily, nudging Osrith to look at Miral's expression, of derision. Scornful of what, Osrith didn't know. Young Odda took the news. Young Odda scorned Miral, but refused to say more. And news had come that Lord Odda was leaving for Winchester, which meant the majority of the guard were to be leaving too. King Alfred's daughter. We go to the betrothal, Elfrith explained. Miral had only cynicism to offer yet again. Osrith wondered whether she would be going too, or if she was to continue to guard the Lady Mildrith. She found her answer the next morning, a bright autumn morning pouring its rays onto the corridor on which Osrith slept, outside Mildrith's room. As a maid brought up a tray of bread and weak ale to the lady, the usually silent Mildrith called her over. You are going with Odda then? Osrith said nothing, for she knew nothing. Mildrith's words were no question, and Osrith studied her delicate features. I see you care for him, my lady. Osrith bowed her head, then looked at the young woman, perhaps only 5 years older than herself, already endowed with a lifetime of grief. You speak in a strange tongue, she said, looking at Osrith as if trying to work something else. Yet, your words seem familiar. Then, the puzzle seemingly over, worked out, or out aside, Mildrith drifted towards the window. Below, 2 of the younger guards, younger even than Osrith, Herefrith and Godwin, were readying horses. Are you accompanying us, Lady Mildrith? The young woman turned, and she shook her head. I go to the grave of my son the day after tomorrow. Then I will wait for my godfather to return, so he has a purpose in telling me all that is to be told. You are unfailingly kind, my lady. Osrith stepped away. I am going to a monastery, to a nunnery. I am going to dedicate my life to God. To find peace, Lady Mildrith? Yes. She looked at Osrith, and a smile flickered at the corners of her mouth. You are kind, boy. I am not, Osrith thought, then looked at the young woman. I am glad to have met you, Lady Mildrith. You can only go on in your journey of your life, not back. The Lord sees you are safe here. And you? She said, suddenly. You are carrying a huge sadness, I can see that. Mildrith looked on Osrith as if she were a flower, crumpled and dishevelled. Osrith inhaled a huge lungful of air. The Lord saw that I was safe too and caused me to fall into circumstances where I was taught me to fight. The words tumbled out, dangerous words, and Mildrith trod the wooden planks of her room with her silken shoes looking into her eyes. You are a girl, I am a warrior, she corrected Mildrith. Not her, not him, for that defines us too narrowly. I can fight, and I have. Selfishly, I would say that my blade is God's, but not yet. One day, I hope to say that. At that moment, Osrith meant it. What she did not know at that moment was just how hard it would be to keep it. Mildrith leaned across and took up Osrith's hand. It was soft and light as a feather, and then it was over, as the young woman turned. May I pray for your son? Mildrith did not turn as she uttered the name, and the word drifted off into the warm, crisp morning, mingling with the autumn mists rising from the fields, as if it were a spell, and was holding her arms to herself as her thoughts were far away, perhaps in the place in the distant horizon where her eyes had settled, perhaps where her son rested. Mildrith had spoken her son's name, but it had been so soft, Osrith hadn't caught it properly. Instead, she went down to the courtyard, a twinge of sorrow for the young woman's sadness in her chest, before helping Elfrith wrestle the saddles into place on the horses' backs and put the wagons in which Lord Odder's voluminous belongings would travel. As they walked behind the wagon carts, Elfrith looked across to Osrith, who was thinking about the Wessex capital, and once again, "She is never happy, Mildred." Osrith looked back to him. "It was her you were thinking of, were you not?" His dark blue eyes twinkled, as if he had found her weakness. Osrith nodded. "Her father in debt caused her to be made to marry a man to repay that debt. He was a pagan." "The husband?" Osrith could hear the shock in her own voice. Elfrith nodded, lowering his, as Miral nodded them through the narrow gorge through which the party travelled. "And King Alfred approved?" she hissed, in disbelief. "A Dane?" "The Lord pretended to be Christian, said he had been baptized twice." "That was the lie, right there." "Within a year of their marriage went off raiding to Cornwall, returned with a Cornish Briton claiming to be a witch queen who he took up with, repudiating the Lady Mildred, and her baby boy died. Some say it was her witchcraft that did it. The shame to the poor lady was most terrible." "Repudiated?" "Cast aside." Elfrith rephrased, hissing the word across to her as Miral held up a hand to halt them. He had once had a church education, but, like Mildred, his father owed debts, and had paid them with his son's service to Odder. And a distant memory, painful, for it resided in the part of her brain that remembered Culdis, and who had sent her there, reminded Osrith that she already knew he had been married, because of a letter from the Bishop of Exeter, including inquiries about a silver piece of holy work which he seemed to have, of late, in his possession. And so, Osrith did think about Mildred now, as they headed east, towards Wessex's capital. Thoughts of her brother pushed to the back of her mind. 88,888,888. It took 3 days of marching to get to the hills to the west of Wessex's capital. They had travelled slowly east, through stone structures and across the ancient, raised pathway. They had stopped at Ethandun, and one of Odder's priests had given thankful prayers for Alfred's victory. They passed, slowly, the lee in which Osrith had slept for several nights, and she wondered whether the she-wolf still made her home in that sheltered overgrowth. Presumably, her cubs would be long gone. At the west gate, a few words from Miral got it open for them, and Odder and his entourage proceeded along the main street until they came to the kneeling cross at the very center of the city. A left turn got them to the palace, but he wouldn't be there long. That very day, Alfred was leaving to ride north, to a bear on the north bank of the Thames, and Odder was going with them. The reason for the Glugast was that the arrival of the leader, not king, of Mercia was imminent. Betrothal of Alfred's daughter to an ealdorman of Mercia was to follow, so Alfred must return for this happy event. Osrith, meanwhile, with Elfrith, were to remain with the household guard under Steeper's command. Miral was to lead some of the king's men on this expedition and wouldn't be back for several days. "He says Cookham," Elfrith confided, genially, to Osrith, "but he wishes to view the land beyond Cookham, near where Watling Street begins. It is where the border of Daneland is." Daneland. It was the first time that Osrith had heard the name, and her mind conjured up a land north onwards filled only with Danes. Yet, her head knew that it wasn't true. Bibbenberg was still held by her uncle as far as she knew, and there was, of course, Alba. "Don't be disheartened," Elfrith said, passing her the beginnings of the unloading of the wagon. "The household guards here are good fellows. We are all right here, little to guard compared to on the road." Osrith smiled, and picked up the baggage handling process. 88,888,888. It turned out that the excursion to Cookham by the king was taking longer than the fortnight that was originally planned. The progress from Aylesbury had not arrived yet either. As Odder's guards, Elfrith and Osrith were placed under the command of Steeper in the absence of Miral, and that meant early rising from the guardroom and parrying, lunging and blocking practice as the autumnal sun showed its rays. Both Hayard and Godwin, young boys of about 14, were given to Osrith and Elfrith to train with. Neither of them were much good, but both had enthusiasm which, with drilling, and Steeper, The huge head of Alfred's guard gave them drilling. Both had improved within a fortnight. In that fortnight, Osric had learned the customs of Wessex, not only in the palace, such as mealtimes, which seemed to be different to, longer than, the Dunnottar Palace Day Palace, but also because the life within it revolved around the Roman Church. Not that the Irish Church was not Roman, she once had it explained to her by a novice, Elfga, who she had struck up a conversation with in the stables one day. Rather, the Irish Church refused to adhere to the new doctrine that the Pope issued with Augustine's mission. Comsil even died in the same year as Augustine arrived, Elfga said, in a jolly manner as he talked to Osric through the stable window and watched her clean the harnesses. You might have thought those Pelagians might have seen that as a divine sign. Yes, Osric had been about to argue, but remembered that it was her own ancestors, King Oswy, who had decreed that it was to be the Roman Church, not the Irish for the Northumbrians. Elfga, thinking her ignorant from her silence, left her to her tasks, and Osric reflected with satisfaction on the anonymity that being a Lord's guard was giving her. But if Osric thought the mundane nature of her tasks was enough, she did not reckon on, a week before All Saints' Day, that the head guard would begin training for the shield wall. Because you will have to know how to fight properly, no matter whose lord you are, Stipa told them. He then called to his guards, asking all of them to step forward who had fought in a shield wall. Apart from a few younger ones, most stepped forward. And then Osric stepped forward, too. It was clear Stipa was not expecting this, and he eyed Osric with suspicion, trying to work out the joke being played. When he could not, and with all eyes on that morning's drill practice on him, he beckoned her forward. Stand, he commanded, as the guards watched on. In fact, several people watched on, including some of the kitchen servants, eyeing up Godwin and Hayard, their eyes drifting over to her. Now, go. Attack me as if you are part of the shield wall, you piece of Scots scum. Ignoring the fact that she would be sardined with other men at her left and right, shields before her, sixes drawn, and that Stipa's own guards were examining the situation with fascinated amusement, Osric fixed her eyes on the head guard. A look passed between the warriors as she stood there. A suzerainess of whispers circulated around her. But Osric didn't look round, not even when Hayard, who had appeared at Elfrith's shoulder, and shouted, "Gaelish filthy scum! Gaelish scum!" screamed back Stipa, unimaginatively, in her face. But still Osric did not move. And then she moved, her anger, bitterness, at being betrayed by her lord, her estrangement, loss of place, all consolidating into one bright, hard crystal of will, sharp and piercing, grabbing the spear out of Elfga's hand. Why should I, useless CA tilde superscript 1 shite? You only have 100 men, and they fight like an B8 tilde diaris is an agent. Osric punctuated the most important part of her trash talk, in Gaelish. His men were like women, so an opposing enemy might think them a curse, and misstep. It was what Domhnall had done to Ivar, the classic Mum, and he had managed to thrust his sword into the Danish hero's chest as the man made a mistake. She pointed the spear at his throat, the banked-up anger and fury and sadness on the very edge of bursting its reservoir. "Doot!" she screamed, rage primal in her mind, building her up to the point where there would be just her and Stipa and nothing else. "Do Comsil, do Alpin, do you I kneel, and you," Stipa joined in, but broke off as Osric opened her mouth to curdle a scream in her throat, as the Gaels did. Her attack caught Stipa by surprise and he stepped back, a fatal move. Has he really been in a shield wall, as the crush of his own side would have driven him on, and his opposition, Osric in this case, would have had crucial seconds to land a fatal blow. Instead, the head guard buried his sword, expecting Osric to stop. But, the adrenaline from her insults and her yelling drove her on, and she dodged the sword. Osric charged at Stipa, rage draining any fear she may have from her very being. Controlled anger, fixed and prescient was the thing, and Osric was there, knowing her opponent was screaming back at her for the same reason. He was big, Osric could be in no doubt about that. and while that gave him strength and might, the head of King Alfred's guard was likely to be less sprightly than a smaller man. But he was cunning and wise, for though he was so ordinarily stupid that he did not realize his nickname was a cruel joke at his expense, Steeper Snotner knew his enemy too, and had had many years to gauge how Osrith might fight. She went for his legs, which he moved away at the last minute, aiming a kick to her torso, which caught her off guard. Most of the energy did not transfer to her body, however, and Osrith managed to turn, jabbing her spear haft between his legs. It did not matter how big a man was, going for his legs would always unsteady him, and Steeper, though he did not fall, had been unsteadied, and this gave Osrith enough time to take Tag's seeks and jab it towards his calf. She missed, and Steeper wheeled around, knocking Osrith to the floor with the flat of his now exposed blade, and she skidded into the mud and dirt. She hung her head, breathing heavily, aware that her comrades and her students were watching her, Buet bending back almost to the hilt, which showed the blacksmith had done his job very well. Steeper was coming for her again, and she moved aside quickly, labored breathing indicating she had been exhausted by the fight.